you can come at it from various angles. So I'm teaching a course at Johns Hopkins, starting 2.5 weeks from now, on Kabbalah, and I suppose I'll continue thinking up until the very moment about the very approach that I want to take. There are different avenues of breaking into it, and there is no one prescribed way. A student who showed up for a course like that might reasonably expect, a rundown, for example, of some of the history of the discipline. I call it a discipline. I'll get back to that, because to me that's its interest.
Discipline or a practice?
Both.
Okay.
To me, a lot of discipline is involved in the practice. So
right.
I'll call it both. But call it what you will. Those are just words. To approach it historically is probably the most evident or immediate starting point for a perfectly sound way to go. After all, the student shows up at the course. This is what I was about to say. The student shows up at the course, and there are some associations. This is an actual historical phenomenon. It's a school of thought, and you want to know something about what is the nature of this historical phenomenon. Now, I'm a philosophy professor, and I'm interested in the ideas themselves. Some students might be more interested in just learning some history about, just the way you'd study, the way you do comparative religions.
Mm-hmm.
This could be one more thing in your experience of your various comparisons. And I learned a little bit about something of what Kabbalah says.
Is there a value in putting the ideas in their historical context?
Yes. You and I have had this conversation about science, and I think it's the same answer. There's a very as far as education is concerned, I think we should, if we have two eyes, we should keep one eye on history and society. That's one side of it. The socio-historical side of it. The real people who make the discipline. And know something about them and their struggles and their complexity, and the fact that no two of them spoke exactly the same. That's also the individuality of each one of them. So yes, history is very important. But to me, just as important, or I confess, of overriding importance, is what you can nonetheless, at the same time, extract from that history. And to me, again, it's just a function of who I am as a philosophy professor. To me, the climax, the important action of the whole enterprise is in extracting from the history and saying, okay now, but what is there here which is of contemporary, enormous, theoretical, and practical significance? And it's got to be real. And our lives are complex. Yes, we need help thinking, that's theory. But we also need help in terms of how should I behave in this very complicated world of ours? What should I do?
Well, if you are looking at it from the standpoint of someone who was coming to become a practitioner and to incorporate the discipline into their life, they would have a very different perspective, and the history would probably be tangential to their desires. But like you said, the history can become useful if you're looking at the theory and how it might be put into application. That's a different thing.
And you learn a lot from history, but in the final analysis, people are a little too credulous about history. My favorite case is that the predominant school of thought in actual Kabbalistic circles today, let's start with just Jewish Kabbalistic circles today, and in particular, for example, in Chabad, which to its credit is one of the only, the Lubavitcher Jews, they have, it's called Tanya. It's written by the third Rebbe, the founder of their particular form of it, Shneur Zalman. And it is, and this particular wing of contemporary Judaism takes as its primary recent literature something which is very heavily Kabbalistic. And they believe in Kabbalah quite strongly.
Well, why don't we take a look at what are some of the core basic ideas that belong to Kabbalah?
I wanted to complete that prior thought in a better way, but edit this out if you will. But help me on this. Where was I going?
Talking about history, theory, and practice.
I was talking about history, theory, and practice. Yeah. All right. Take again. The received idea by these Lubavitchers is that the Kabbalistic theory of Luria, Isaac Luria, is the most sophisticated version that we have. I think that's wrong. History does not tell you who, in the final analysis, is the smart one from back then. In this particular case, these are writers from the 1600s, okay? Luria is from the 1600s, and ever since his time, his teachings, as written down by others primarily, have been the predominant in Kabbalistic circles. But I think that there are some fundamental theoretical errors there. It gets very interesting because there's a big crossover between the Jews and the Gentiles, historically. It turns out that the original Kabbalists, first of all, were very emphasized by Gentile culture, but at the same time, the causal arrows are always going in both directions, always going in both directions. At the same time, the Kabbalists exerted a very interesting amount of intellectual influence upon Europeans of all kinds, including leading Gentile Hermeticists and so forth, Paracelsus and whatnot. So Kabbalah became very influential in Gentile culture, and a lot of Gentiles took it very, very seriously, studied Hebrew in order to be able to do it on that particular level. Some of them wrote eminent books. There are many, many books on Kabbalah written by Gentiles, which are of first significance, of good significance, and many by Jews as well. What I'm saying here is that if you try to pin down what is Kabbalah, after all, do the Jews own it? That's another historical question. No. Unfortunately, the life of the mind doesn't work that way, that any people can ever exercise permanent ownership of an idea. It doesn't work that way in history. Whoever has it, has it.
Unlike industry that can own many intellectual properties.
That's right. And the way is open for us to consider the importance of Gentile interpretations, but after all, it's all interpretation. It's all theorizing and interpretation. You wanted to know what I take to be the core notion, and I'm looking when you do that, and you want to start in some kind of appropriate way. You take a look at the tree of life. You'll put something in the tape. I have here just one depiction of it. Each of these circles is called a sephirah. Plural is sephirot. There are 10 of them, although two different versions, at least two very significantly different versions of what those 10 are. It's only a slight difference, but an important one. But the standard version is always 10 of these, arranged in a very interesting kind of array. And what's quite remarkable about this picture is that it is claimed to be the picture of, well, what shall we say for starters? In some sense, it's the anatomy of God. Now, as soon as you say that, you have to qualify it, of course, because the scholars who came up with this want to emphasize that we don't have any direct and immediate perception of God. But all of that having been said, you have to understand. One thing you got to understand, to put it in our languages, is a huge dose of theosophy, Rudolf Steiner and all that stuff, but not just theosophy. That's actually the wisdom about God. But to put it in different terms, gnosis, knowledge of the divine structure.
Now,
It claims that in some sense, you always have to use a phrase like in some sense, because there's always going to be this gesture that you get involved in religion where you want to say, but of course, we don't know God in his absolute perfection. That is infinitely removed from us. I'm speaking somewhat cynically about that, because in some sense, the real dynamite of the message that comes through is that there really is, in Kabbalah, a very strong sense of belief that the human species does come into knowledge of God.
At this point, as someone who's not terribly familiar with Kabbalah, let me see if I can maybe rephrase in terms of how I'm perceiving what you're saying, in that we're in the Christian context and from other religions, there are really two major concepts of God. In Christianity, one of them is called the Godhead. Now, the Godhead is that word that's referred to the totally unimaginable, incomprehensible nature of God. We use words like omnipresent, omniscient, because we have no other words to use, and in all actuality, those words lack meaning in that, other than being superlatives outside our realm of experience, that doesn't help me at all to understand what God is. So we have I guess we would call it the real nature of God, that is the Godhead, but man must now find a way of making the unimaginable imaginable so he can relate to it. So I'm assuming that the tree of life is a metaphor that allows us to bridge the gap in terms of a relationship to what God might be. Although it's rather symbolic, it is something that most people can wrap their minds around in terms of making progress, in terms to identify with God and maybe understand him, that brings it down to the level that a Christian would understand this as this was the role of Jesus. He's a living metaphor for what God might be, but in the end, if we don't understand the distinction between the metaphor and the true nature of God, that we are dealing with metaphors, and they tend to be somewhat human and anthropomorphic, so they do have limitations, but without it, we have no mechanism by which to understand God.
I think that the Jewish Kabbalists are, in loose terms, schizophrenic about this whole question of the knowability of God. I think...
Is this because of the first commandment?
Take your Godhead, the transcendent deity, of whom we cannot speak, or at most can speak analogically or metaphorically in our all too human way.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the best we can pretend. Why even can we pretend to that much? It becomes a question. And some would say we can't, and fall into a sense of utter gulf between themselves and a God they cannot comprehend. It's one religious tendency. And you see it in Judaism, with its very stern notion of a God who won't even allow his picture to be painted in the second commandment. No graven images.
Or to say his name even.
Yeah. So far removed am I. Do not try to represent me. Your representations are beside the point. They get in the way. They make it seem as if I'm something I'm not. I'm not something that is visualizable. I'm not something that is imaginable, that you can make an image of.
That's actually a very Buddhist concept, in the fact that your mental constructs get in the way of true understanding, that there's a differentiation that you must understand, that while you're dealing with mental constructs, they actually aren't the real thing, and you need to understand that.
Yeah, but in Judaism, a lot of that sometimes exists without the mystical consolation, that there's something you can do besides the concepts. You see, it's all very well to think concepts bring you up to a certain point, and maybe in Eastern religions you get the idea, but nonetheless there's a way of being that takes you beyond concepts and does put you into proximity with the divine. There's another aspect, another turn on that, on the part of the person who feels that God is just transcendent, and there's nothing I can do to bridge that gap. I know nothing of God. In any event, where's Kabbalah in all of this? I sometimes think, and you'll hear me say phrases like this, because that's what life is like. And sometimes when I say something like this, I'm making a dramatic point. Sometimes I feel like presenting it this way. Sometimes it seems as if these Jews who came up with Kabbalah, and I call it schizophrenic, wanted to say something out of one side of their mouth that contradicted something they wanted to say out of the other side of their mouth. What they wanted to say out of one side of their mouth is, we really think we can describe the essential structure of spirit, of what spirit is, and that is to say also what divinity is, the divine nature is, what God is. That, let's put it in historical perspective now, is precisely the moment at which you run all the risks of claiming to know God, of violating the first and second, the whole idea of the Godhead, of claiming to know God. It sounds like a heresy, and there is something vaguely, you start to understand Kabbalah when you understand it. You may want to argue that the charges shouldn't hold, that Kabbalah could defend itself against the charge successfully. But just as there is something in John, the Gospel of John, that makes you want to say, there is a Gnostic tendency at work here. There clearly is a Gnostic tendency of a different kind involved in Kabbalah, which involves the practitioner of Kabbalah in his day-to-day work, somebody who could feel as if he's on the verge of a certain kind of madness even. Because you get convinced, if you do this, take it from me, this is my life right now. If you do this, and with all deference, you get the uncanny feeling that you are beginning to understand the divine secrets. It doesn't make you more than human, but it does lead to a very, very strange reconceptualization of the whole thing. That there's, if you want to call it a wisdom we shouldn't get into, that also, the Kabbalists, of course, there's a mystery about them, and they were held up to a certain amount of suspicion, these guys who were trying to plumb these divine secrets. But make no mistake, in some sense, I keep saying that, using that phrase, in some sense, they were doing precisely that. They were trying to plumb the divine mysteries. figure out what God was, with a very, very, very strange payoff in that particular case. So but what the payoff is, hold off on that for a second, but go back. Now, on the one side, there's all of that. And then on the other side, but they're good Jews. And they understand that God infinitely transcends. How can they possibly put these two things together? How can they possibly put together their traditional Jewish belief in the utter transcendence of God, that we can never know God in that sense, with what they seem to be doing as they work at their bench, which is plumb the nature of the divine? There's a contradiction there in Kabbalah itself. I have to negotiate that contradiction, because I have to look at it, and I have to say, all right, where am I going to go with this? And if I say it's a contradiction, then to me it is. This is what I'm saying. If to me it's a contradiction, what am I going to do with it? I'm going to try to work on that contradiction. And frankly, this is where it gets spooky. Admittedly, if there's anything that has to go, it's the you can't understand God part that has to go. Because I'm a philosophy professor, and these people are trying to present to me something which pretends to be the essence of the divine. I think it's understandable. I think it makes sense.